season up a storm here. Good Lord. I think that's the cold kick. Yep. So that was a bit of food in my chin too. I just finished dinner. Sorry about that. Wow. I'm all sorts of a mess today. All right. Where were we? Vestiges, my world build. Okay, so after the last time we were talking, I've been doing some planning and thinking through some of the worlds I've built. Because the funny thing about my world build for my story setting is it's really more like 4 to 8 story settings. Now, I'm mainly focusing on the primary and secondary settings. The possibility of doing tertiary settings connected to the worlds that you hop out on, like my tendency in some of my stuff is to say, like, should I do this or this? Why not both? And so I have a tendency to do that. It tends to make much more complicated settings. And so when last time I was on here talking about the possibility of doing a the mechanism for switching between worlds being something that instead of switching over, like, I want the characters to be able to switch worlds and start as a new character in a new setting. So like setting 1, you start out at, or the prime setting is, you start out as what you assume are just average teenagers in the setting. And it's a road trip sort of adventure where it's a coming of age kind of thing. And the characters grow into the heroes they're going to be. And then the heroes go on their heroes' journeys and they uncover the major plot and the major villain. And ultimately, that major conflict in the hero's journey, you have this moment of the crisis. So you've gone through all the steps, you've uncovered the thing that you must confront, and you think you're going to be able to achieve it. You go to that confrontation, and there's called a setback. And the setback is when you realize that you haven't resolved something important to make you the person who can take this situation and into control. You are not currently able to defeat the villain because there's something still more that you need to do to grow to the person who can win. And for me, where I was going with this was that in this case is very literally the moment where all seems lost. The heroes fail, they die, and then they wake up in another world. Now, it can be any one of the other 3 worlds that I said as my primary set of, or my, I guess I'm calling them my first tier worlds. So that's superhero, Medusas, or zombie apocalypse. Now, for the mechanism of falling out of the primary realm into these first tier worlds, that's a fairly easy thing to do. It's sort of like the shattering of the sum of the whole into the fragments, the vestiges of who they are. That's pretty easy to work out. But the problem I'm having, it's not really a huge problem, but among those first tier worlds, you have 3, 6, 8, however many you want to do. The 3 that I've established as the ones I'm going to wander through when I first play test this game with some friends is the 3 worlds. How do you say you come from the overworld, land in, say, the Medusa world? How do you move from the Medusa world to the superhero world? Now, there are a couple different potential paths from moving from Medusa superhero to zombie apocalypse. And then there's the question of, can they get to a point where they can come back from those tiers back into the prime level where they started once before? Now, the question I have for doing that is, do they go from the prime plane to the tertiary, the secondary, that first tier world, climb back to the prime universe, and then fall back out, and then back in, and then back out, and back in? That seems sort of convoluted, and it compromises, I think, some of what I want to do. Part of the goal to trekking through the first tier worlds is to find a way back in to who you were before. But it's a possibility. So basically the way I've set that is, in each of the first tier worlds that I want to go to, each of them sort of has an Atlantis or a Valhalla or what's the Lost City of Gold, the Fountain of Youth, these mythical lost places. El Dorado, that's what I was thinking of. So these mythical lost places in each of these worlds sort of serve as the gateway through which you can pass to get back to that prime reality. Now, the mythology I've built around this setting is one in which the prime setting is the realm in which the gods live out their lives partially unaware of their godhood, and then they're shattered into their components, which are people on these first tier worlds. Now, people on the first tier worlds can pass into the afterlife through death. That's a totally workable, that's doable. That's one of the methods you can leave the first tier world to get back to the prime realm, is to die. I don't want that to be the sought after path. So what that tends to lead to is having to do the equivalent of like Dante's Inferno. In Dante's Inferno, he doesn't actually die, but he passes into the realm of the dead physically. So his body and he within it walked into the realm of the dead. And there are some mythologies where you can do that. You can go to the cave. That's the opening into Hades in mythology. And that is a method of crossing into the realm of the dead that you can take. And that's potentially one method of switching between worlds. But that, again, is focused between the difference between, say, the prime world. That isn't Medusa to superhero and from superhero to zombie apocalypse setting. The doorways between those may also be traversed. The question is, in this case, I don't want it to be the same as crossing back into the prime realm. So the heavenly divine realm is a realm you cross over to in either death or by finding the doorway through which you can cross over physically into the realm of the divine. So there are two ways to do that. But in both of those cases, you arrive as the person who died. So say you start out as Steve the Bard, and you're living on the divine realm. And on that divine realm, you are shattered. And you wake up in the Medusa realm as Stephanie the Medusa, and you must confront certain things and go on a quest to see if you can figure out how you could get back to the divine realm. Now, you could either die and pass back into divine realm, or you can find a gateway and cross through that gateway back into the divine realm as Stephanie, not as the male bard, who was the divine piece, the divine whole of which Stephanie is but a piece. Now, Stephanie, the Medusa, may confront certain circumstances and end up shifting over into Calvin, the superhero in the superhero realm. Now, Calvin is just another vestige of Steve the Bard. And if if Calvin the superhero were to find a device that opens a portal, and an arch-villain is building a doomsday device, and at the core of this device is an object that, when triggered in the right way, tears open a portal to the divine realm, then Calvin goes into the divine realm as Calvin. Not as Stephanie, because that's the previous life they lived in on another world, and not as Stephen the Bard. It's Calvin. You arrive in that realm as Calvin. And, switching from Stephanie to Calvin, or from Calvin to whoever he is in the zombie apocalypse realm, those have to be a shift of not just world, but body and life. Because it's important, when I've built the Medusa setting, to be a world where all of the beings, like, instead of having humans and building human cities and human civilizations and the Greco-Roman culture populated by human beings, this is sort of like Planet of the Apes, is sort of what I want to call it. Because in Planet of the Apes, you have a human being who has somehow traversed across a universe to find themselves in a distant future. Again, this is time travel in the real story. In my story, it's just world hopping. But when Charlton Heston, is that his name? Charlton Heston arrives on the Planet of the Apes, the whole situation of humans and apes have been switched. So you have the intelligent, talking, technologically developing apes and the savage, mute, intellectually inferior humans. So sort of swapping what we have existing in our world. By the same token, I kind of want to do the same thing with the idea of Greece and Rome and civilization and mythology, but instead of taking like the human Perseus and the cities and populations of the Greco-Roman region in the Mediterranean, I would much rather see what would happen with a Medusa-led civilization, like a monster, a slayer of men, a reclusive cave-dwelling beast that slays people that come to bother it, and make a civilization out of them, and have the humans be seen as these savage, brutish monsters living on the fringes of reality. And so I kind of want to explore that setting. But to do that, I want to build it around the idea of a Medusa, not as an individual, but as the foundations of an entire society. And even more than one society. So one of the tricks I want to play with that is looking at the idea of a Medusa is a reptile female. They have never talked about a male Medusa. There's no such thing. It doesn't exist in mythology, and it's not really existed for most versions of the D&D game. Now, when you have this concept of just females, you have an equivalent of a male only species in the satyrs of Greek mythology, but you also have the female only dryads and nymphs. There isn't equivalent of a dryad that's male. So, like, it's kind of key to the identity of the characters. So Medusas, I want to be, strictly speaking, an all-female species. And the way I figured doing that is some reptiles can reproduce asexually. There's a type of lizard called the whiptail lizard, and they lay eggs that hatch into pretty much a clone of the mother. And so you have this civilization that's done this way. You've built up an entire population through that methodology. There are a few things to keep in mind that you can get certain kinds of conditions that may develop. So like if you were to have some form of what we call dwarfism in our culture right now, if you were to reproduce parthenogenically, which is the asexual reproduction that way, the child will be essentially a clone of the parent. So if you have a parent with that, if your entire population is reproducing in that same methodology, you can get an entire population of Medusas with dwarfism, and thus you could build a population of dwarves, like we tend to think of in our mythology. Dwarves are a race, but in this case, that they're a condition that was reproduced and becomes the foundations of that species, that subspecies. And doing the same thing in a few other directions could lead to a few other, like elven equivalents or things like that. So you've built out this whole fantasy setting that have variations and sub-races of this Medusa race, but they're all female and they reproduce parthenogenically. If you're going to drop a character, a player and their character into that setting, I don't necessarily want them to be able to come from the superhero setting or the zombie apocalypse setting where they may play Steve the barbarian. I want them to jump into that civilization and live within that civilization and inhabit that world and its rules. You have an entire region of the known world who has never seen a man. It would be fun on one or two occasions to chunk in men from another world. But that's not the focus for the first round of playthrough of that world. I want to drop my player characters into a vestige of their deity that is a female Medusa, and have them try to figure out, like, how can they reconcile this part of their overall character. And likewise, when they shift out of the Medusa world to, say, maybe the superhero world, I don't want it to be a bunch of Medusas wandering around in a superhero world. That's not the goal. The superhero world was one I developed specifically for taking the concept of taking somebody from an adolescent with the possibility of becoming a superhero through one of 5 mechanisms, potentially 6 mechanisms. And so I kind of want it to be I want it to be something where you switch bodies. You inhabit another you. And so that doorway between those two worlds, where you switch from a Medusa to a superhero, to a zombie apocalypse survivor, I want it to be one where you leave everything you just had behind to trek through to the next world. And that mechanism between switching, I haven't quite figured out the knack just yet. But one of the things I talked about the last time was the possibility of setting it up as an event you trigger. So it's a place you get to with a key to unlock a door that you can pass through, and that door puts, hides your body in stasis while you move into a next body. Or it's a timer. You've got a deadline where you're going to be in this world for 3 months, and you've got to solve something. Either like you're in this world for 3 months, and if you don't solve what you need to solve, it's going to jump you into the next world. Or you could do it the other way around, where you have 3 months to find the key to somewhere else. Otherwise, you are stuck in that world. So there's either way I could do that. I haven't quite figured out the right choice for that yet. But that is sort of the idea behind switching between worlds and switching bodies. I did kind of hatch on my classic problem of, if this or this made more sense, why not both? And so I had that brief moment last time where I was talking about the possibility of doing subworlds to my primary worlds. So off the Medusa world, there might be another world with some similarities, and that setting could be easier to navigate between the worlds. So say you had 2 subworlds to the Medusa world. You leave Medusa world and go into Medusa subworld 1, and leave that one subworld 2, and maybe back to Medusa world. That's definitely a possibility of something I could do. I just think it adds layers of complication I don't need to address just yet, when I haven't figured out how to navigate the first 3 worlds. But it's something I'm trying to keep in mind, because I don't want to build a setup that doesn't allow that option to come in later. So I got to figure out, I think if I build it so that the navigation from the prime divine realm down to the sub-realms, the first layer realms, is sort of very nearly perfectly one way, and make it so bloody hard to get back up from these 3 layer 1 worlds, that you may not be able to do it in the first world. And so you have to find a way into a parallel world where the option might be better available. And that seems to me the best way to set that up. As you fall from the divine realm, you land in one of the sub-realms, and you learn more about the situation you're in and the circumstances that you're working within. and you find a way to shift over to another realm through which it might be easier to cross back into the divine realm. And as I'm saying this, I'm thinking I might have an option. So when building this, we have the Medusa realm is based off of Greek myth, and there should theoretically be a way to cross over into the divine realm, a doorway, a gateway into Hades. And so that's one possibility. The possibility of going to the zombie apocalypse realm where the dead roam the earth again, sort of, not quite. That's not how I'm building my zombie apocalypse, but just for the sake of argument, you're having a connection to where the dead go, which is the divine realm. So whatever mechanism is allowing that to cross over and destroy that world and infest that world, backtracing that may be your doorway back through. And the superhero realm, I'm not really sure what the choice is there for that being the right doorway. I think that one really feels like there's almost no doorway there. So that's kind of the one I want to drop them in first anyway. So I take them from the divine realm, they fall down into the realm of the superhero character. There's not really a doorway from the superhero characters back into the divine realm. But maybe they can find a doorway from superheroes to either Medusa or the zombie apocalypse, which both have potential doorways back into the divine realm. It's got some options there. I think that kind of works. I've also been doing some brainstorming on the specifics of each of those settings, and I'm having a lot of fun with it, really, because it's world building. I love that aspect of this. So I've also been trying to play with some mechanisms. I think one of the things I talked about last time was in the divine realm, I want them to basically start out with an equivalent of psionic powers. So they start out in their realm with some base level special ability that's uniquely theirs. So they roll a die and they figure out what their ability is and how they can involve it in their character. To have an equivalent option for each of the subsettings. So World 1, Superhero World. I set up a mechanism by which I wanted them to be able to roll a 20-sided die. And that 20-sided die, the result it lands on will tell me, the game master, what's likely to happen for them. So what I did was I built a list of 1 through 20, and I split it into 5. And that split, each one of those numbers, 1 through 20, I've established to be one of 5 types. So number 1 would be you get some sort of magically enchanted weapon to connect with. So this would be the equivalent of Witchblade or maybe Thor's hammer, something like that. This is something that without it, you are just a mortal being. But with access to it, you are the equivalent of a superhero. Number 2 on the list is essentially taking a look at the idea of, if you were to do a D&D superhero mythological setting, everybody's human, sort of like Game of Thrones, but you wanted to put into that setting a Superman type character, the last son of Krypton. What would that character be? And in my mind, like instantly I go to, well, they sent their last son of Krypton to Earth and allowed him to be raised as a child by humans. This is Changelings Mythology 101. You know, giving a human parents a Fey child to raise. And so, like, I feel like you could totally do that. You could have an elf raised among humans, seeming to be human, but always being distinctly different in some way. And so that's your Superman. From there, I wanted to look at the possibility of doing I think I sort of jokingly just razzed at it. The Inhumans from Marvel are beings that were tinkered with genetically at some point. Inhumans in Marvel mythology are the descendants of people whose genes were altered by another alien race. I always kind of hated that narrative chunk, but whatever. But I did find a way to make it make sense within the D&D mythology. We have races like Aasimar, which are the offspring of angelic beings. We have the Tieflings, which are an offspring of demonic beings. And we have the Genasi, which are an offspring of genies, essentially, the Jinn. And then there's another one, there's called Yontai, which are, I believe, if I'm getting that one right, I got to remember which ones I set where. Yeah, so Yontai are people who made a bargain with a serpent demon at some point to be partially transformed. They're sort of serpent humans. And so each one of these is sort of like a human, but not really. They're different, but their heritage is sort of covered to a certain degree until they manifest it in some way. And at least that's the way I want to build it in the setting. So you could be a Tiefling, a Genasi, a Aasimar, or a Yuan-ti, but you would just be another human until you are connected to some stone that brings out your ancestral heritage and twists you into something not quite human anymore. And so that's a possibility of doing that. And so you have those 4 options to land on when you roll that die, because you don't get to pick that. That's your heritage. It's something that happened to an ancestor of yours. You don't get to pick it. You just got to figure out how to survive with it if that's your case. And then similarly with the Superman style character being elves, I set it up as elves is the first one that came to mind, but I also wanted to do sort of dwarves, just to be fair, and then I think I did what was the other one? Triton. Tritons are basically mermen, something equivalent to that. And then shifters, I think was the other one, and that's from Eberron. It's just another thing to play with. But so you've got that, and then you have the I gave enchanted weapons. There are 4 types of those. So it's like there's a weapon, there is a cape, there is a book, and there are magic gems. And that's sort of where I set it to start with. There are ways to change some of those so that you can do slightly differently each time you wanted to play this game. But I set it up as having at least 4 different types of enchanted things that you could network with that would grant you powers. And then there's the Spider-Man or Daredevil type power, which is something that's inflicted on you by some kind of something. In this case, it's probably going to be some alchemical mixture or some weird potion or a laboratory experiment gone wrong. And then, basically you have the enchanted item, inflicted powers, which I haven't really explored much because I want that to be a little more freeform. Every character gets a shot at a bunch of different abilities they could do. But I don't want it to be so freeform that it's essentially, we'll give you a free spell. I don't want it to be quite that. So I got to figure that out a little bit more. But enchanted item, inflicted power, the Inhumans, and the Superman factor. But then there's the fifth one, which is Marvel's sort of X-Men kind of characters, the mutants. You're born with this potential to change into a superhero, and at a certain age, you just turn into a mutant. And my setting difference is that those mutants, the X-Men universe looks at mutants as, scary monsters with abilities, and they treat them horribly, and there's bias and mistreatment that way. To do the equivalent in the D&D setting, I literally made it when you mutate, when you hit the age at which you mutate, you change from an ordinary teenager into a monster. And I had this big long list I was originally using. It was a 20-part list because I wanted to take a D20 and you roll and you can turn into any one of 20 different monsters. But the problem I was having with that is that's thematically not too bad, except for if we're going to be superhero characters where you have a special ability that you use to benefit the people around you, and if you're going to be a mutant, an X-Men type character, the theme of X-Men is they use their powers to help the people who even fear and mistrust them because it's the right thing to do. And that's harder to say if you just say, well, they turned into a Minotaur. Well, they don't have, they're strong, I guess. They're strong as a bull. What's their power? What are they using to benefit humanity? I've just essentially just turned them into monsters, not into mutant heroes. And so I said, all right, so I got to rethink some of this. And so I sat down and really did it. And now I've put it into 4 different types, really, that I'm using as the base for the mutants. So I have the Harpy. So you're a flyer, you have wings, but you also have the Harpy sound abilities, the shriek or scream or whatever they call it. And then I have the doppelgangers, or the shapeshifters. And then I have the troll, which are the ones that can heal most damage. And then I have the dragonborn, because it's Dungeons and Dragons, and having a lizard man that can breathe fire. Yes, of course, yes. And so that's sort of like, those are the 4 like truly empowered, and maybe at a certain point you could swap 1 or 2 of those out for a different feel, but in any given game you're playing, the odds are that you're not going to have more than 2 people who roll to be a mutant as players. And it's important to play those characters as mutants in a group of people who were raised in a society that view mutants as potentially dangerous monsters. So it's fun to play that with characters against each other. But it's also important to note that I have 4 options for how to be a mutant here. In a party of 6, you might be able to get a game going where you have as many as 8 players going at a time. You are very unlikely to run through all 4 options of mutants in that size of a party. It's not likely at all. So having 4 to start with is enough. I think at another point, if you wanted to dig up some more options and make them as alternatives, it's totally doable. So at this point, what I really have left is to figure out how I'm going to handle the 4 gained abilities, the Spider-Man, Daredevil type abilities, because that one's going to be a little more important. That one's going to be like, you are still human as far as anybody can see. You've just gained powers through some method, and potentially a drawback involved with it too. But I want to be able to not just say like, well, these are the 4 abilities that you get to choose from. I want it to be, I'm debating whether or not I want to do it as some form of, you have mental abilities, physical abilities, sensory abilities, and spiritual abilities, or something like that. I got to debate that in my head a little bit about what's the right path to take that on. But I do think that giving them a category rather than an ability gives a little more flexibility of that being just about anything. So that's sort of what I'm doing with the superhero world. I think we're getting close enough to 45 minutes that I may set off discussion of the Medusa world and the zombie apocalypse world till later. But I will briefly say that I did some similar amounts of planning out how to generate different sets of abilities. Like the zombie apocalypse world, the way I've built that to happen is not really what we would consider a traditional zombie. This one's actually similar to the movie Venom, where what you've got is, and I haven't seen the movie yet, so I'm just assuming that's what the story is, but you've got a tar-like goopy symbiote that can essentially infect you. And once it's in you, it can convert you over to a monster. It can use your body. I want it to be similar to that in some regards, where there's this tar-like amorphous amoeba kind of creature that can get into a human being and infect them and drive them mad and slowly eat them from the inside until they've absorbed that human being. And in the process, you have different stages of being a zombie, or zombie, I guess. You have that early stages of a human being knowing that something's eating them from the inside and slowly going crazy in pain and madness. And that's already terrifying. You then have the next stages where the thing within them is working its way through the skin, and so maybe they chew their fingertips off and little tendrils form claws of black tar, and their eyes start to turn black and weep black, and they chew at their lips until black teeth form. And just, I mean, that's terrifying. And they at that point, they're full psychotic. They're hunters. They will kill, eat, and infect anything else they can get a hold of. And you just, as it spreads further and takes over more, there's less of the human being behind and more of this monstrous tar that's puppeting around the remains of the person it infected. And so these claws, when they rip into your skin, if they leave even a little bit of a trace that can get into your body through the skin, starts to spread an infection. So it's this infectious, monstrous entity. And I really love this idea of taking it further. But on the same token, I want to be able to use that. Every character has the potential to be a type of hero in each setting. And so for this one, I brainstormed up a few options as to ways that we can put a twist on this. What are the special abilities? What makes these characters distinct from other players? And so for this one, there are a couple twists. I'll probably go into this tomorrow, but I rolled up 4 or 5 options that you roll a d20, and each of those options is a possibility of something. And you are one of those things, but you don't know which one until the circumstances that make it happen. And then the Medusa setting I'm struggling a little bit with, because that one is set really more to, like, Medusa is somebody whose gaze turns somebody to stone. That's just the character's mythology. Do I give everybody that one ability, or do I try to figure out a variance on that? You know, I want that setting to be one in which the people who have the ability to turn people to stone are considered blessed. They're given the gift of the ancestor. And so that has to be what's the chance that you have that ability kind of thing. So what does everybody else have? So I'm looking at the possibility of like a poisonous Medusa, a petrifying gaze Medusa. What are some of the other options that I can do? And so I've got to brainstorm how that's going to all work out. But I will cover that on another day, because I think we're pretty much at the end of what I got time for tonight. I try to set myself a schedule. I did sort of build up the mechanics tree for some of these so that options, I really built it so that when you roll a 20-sided die, you have option 1, 6, 11, and 16 are one set of abilities. Options 2, 7, 12, and 17 are another. So that when you roll, it's literally just like, it's a total gamble, and you have no real way of knowing what the number you have rolled means. But I'll know because I'll have the chart in front of me, and I can make the reveal of what your special ability is part of the story of your first interactions going forward. And that's really the hope here, is you build a character, you try to tell that character's story, and then these weird circumstances that are part of your character's story come into play, and you have to figure out how to deal with that hand that you're dealt. And how does that affect how you express your character from world to world? How do you express and handle that consequence? And it's a very complicated idea, but when isn't something that I come up with overly complicated and tricky to handle? That's just the way my brain works. All right, we're past 45. I should probably go tonight. I know I have enough to talk about. I'm hoping I'm doing reasonably good tomorrow. I still got a little bit of a cold hitting me. I don't know if it's getting worse or better or what, but it's likely to be coming into the next week. And I got work tomorrow, but I should be out in enough time to give me time to prep to do a little more talking about some of these points tomorrow. I know I say that every time, and immediately the next day it never happens because too much happens in my life, but I will try. Until then, take care and have a good night. I hope you're doing well. I know you were struggling for a little while with some stuff. Yeah, we'll see. I hope. Yeah, I've had my big colds for the last, well, I guess it was almost a year ago, so I might be due again. I hope not. We'll see. See you later. Yeah, there we go.